to the Graduate Environmental Engineering Seminar Series. This is the third seminar in the semester. And today I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Ankur Desai, who is the Reid Bryson Professor of Climate, People, and Environment in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences and the Nelson Institute Center for Climatic Research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His lab studies and has authored over 100 articles regarding ecosystems, weather, and climate. This work spans from Wisconsin to the globe and uses both long-term observations in nature and advanced computer simulations. Dr. Desai received his bachelor's degree in computer science and environmental studies from Oberlin College, a master's degree in geography from the University of Minnesota, and a PhD in meteorology from the Pennsylvania State University. Ankur is also an American Meteorological Society certified consulting meteorologist. Currently, he is a visiting professor at Michigan Technological University while he's on leave, sabbatical leave from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'll let him take over from here, but I just want to mention that today Dr. Desai will be giving his seminar on energetic ecosystems emit enchanting emissions, which, if I remember from my middle school, high school English, is an alliteration. I hope I got that right. But I also wanted to mention that he will be giving another seminar, related seminar, in the Biological Sciences Department. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ankur Desai. And again, welcome.
Cool. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Quick thumbs up if that looks all good. Somebody. All right, good. Cool. So yes, the title is alliterative. I like to give fun titles. Hopefully it drew some of you here who might have not otherwise attended, and hopefully I'll be able to live up to the title with the rest of the talk as I talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing with understanding ecosystems and the energy balance of Earth. So we had a little bit of introduction there. I just want to give a little bit more about, oops, excuse me, I'm on the wrong screen. Who am I and what am I doing here? And so it was mentioned briefly that I've been at UW-Madison for 13 years. I've also been a director of graduate studies there. I edit the Journal Geophysical Research by Geosciences. So I'm on sabbatical leave from the university this year, and I decided that it would be fun to spend half my time up here where you have a lot of great colleagues in the two fields I work a lot in, atmospheric sciences and in ecology. I have three main hosts here that have been helping me work my way to get up here, which is a little bit of a challenge with the pandemic and everything, but Raymond Shaw in physics, Amy Marcarelli in biology, and Noel Urban in the civil and the Great Lakes. And Research Center have been helping me out. And so certainly if you're trying to find connections or connect to me, one of those three can help you. I'm hoping to meet people, make new collaborations, maybe write papers. As you can see, I have a pretty broad range of interests from surface atmosphere interactions to carbon cycle, to snow cover in models, to data assimilation. And given the pandemic, I'm happy to meet virtually, but we can also meet outside on trails, slopes, open areas whenever you want. I have an office in Dow at 809. Also mentioned that my spouse is a high school teacher who's working virtually here from her apartment, and I have two daughters in Houghton Middle School now, and an older daughter who's a freshman at Tech and an instructor at Ripley. So come reach out if you have ways that we can meet up or hang out. And as was mentioned by Dr. Becker, I'll also be giving a seminar in biology. It will be more focused on the carbon cycle side of my work, and that's on March 18th at 3 o'clock. So I like to start with this animation of a scanning electron microscope image of a stomata, which is usually about 1/10 of the width of a human hair, right? A stomata on a leaf opens and closes through biochemical mechanisms that allows carbon dioxide to go in and water vapor to go out. And it's just an amazing process when you look at this at the scale of an individual leaf, which can have hundreds of thousands of stomates on a leaf, and this individual tree that can have millions to tens of millions to the entire ecosystem, all of which are doing the exact same thing and influencing one of the largest and most dramatic transformations we see on Earth's surface as we go seasonally from spring to summer to fall to winter in the high latitudes and mid latitudes, and as we go from wet and dry seasons into tropics and into subtropics. And the effect of that is seen in this satellite image of vegetation greenness over the last 10 years is this transformation of Earth's surface as that vegetation senesces and grows and transpires water and takes up CO2. And at first blush, you're like, well, that's great. Biology is awesome. But one of the things I'm really interested in is how it interacts with the Earth system as a whole. And so this is a diagram of what's called Earth's energy balance. And it's a little bit complicated, so I'll just walk through it here. Basically, you have energy coming in from the sun, right? That's what drives all of Earth's life, as well as weather and climate. And you have energy going out in the form of infrared radiation as part of the Earth's surface and laws of physics, as well as the greenhouse effect. But one of the things that's really important is that the difference between those two, there's a small leftover part. That's the energy that actually drives the heating and cooling and transpiring of water and evaporation in Earth. And those are these two little terms in the middle that are called sensible and latent heating. And those are going to be the focus of today's talk, and we'll define them in a little bit more. But it turns out the vegetation on Earth and organisms on land and what they're doing and how they're transpiring and taking up CO2 through those stomates has a strong impact on what these two things are doing in terms of how much you get a sensible heating, or the heating of Earth's air immediately above the surface through what we call fluxes of heat, or latent heating, which is just another word for evapotranspiration, or the movement of water and the eventual energy that's released or taken up during the process of evaporation and condensation. So these two processes that are part of Earth's surface energy budget then has implications for the atmosphere. So I like to think of the atmosphere as a sponge that sits between the large scale dynamics of weather and climate and what vegetation is doing down here. And this sponge, we actually know, we have a name for it in the atmospheric layer, but you can kind of think of it as the heating and moistening of that sponge is going to change the thickness of the sponge, it's going to change the size of these pores, and it's going to change the temperature of that sponge, right? And in many ways, that's actually what's happening in the atmosphere. The lowest layer of the atmosphere is called the boundary layer. The boundary layer is the first kilometer or so. It grows and falls every day as a function of that sensible and latent heating that's happening in Earth's surface, as well as and weather processes like the generation of clouds, or here, the generation of lake effect snow, for example, are strongly influenced by the what's happening in the atmospheric boundary layer. And it turns out we're doing a grand global experiment where vegetation on Earth is changing. This is another kind of busy diagram from Gordon Bonin at Ankur in a paper in Science, really just talking about how forests in particular, how we actually model them in Earth systems. And to understand how they influence the surface energy budget and weather and climate is tied closely to their hydrology, to their photosynthesis and carbon cycle, and to their dynamics of land use change and climate change that's occurring, as well as the general dynamics of vegetation competition. And we're embarking on a grand global experiment right now through global climate change that's influencing and changing how this system operates. I know this personally and directly because one of the sites I work with is this site in northern Wisconsin outside of Park Falls, where we've been measuring with my partners at NOAA the increase in CO2 and its impact on vegetation for the last 25 years. And so this is just a sea tainer, but if you go inside it, what we have is a whole bunch of infrared gas analyzers that are tied and connected and drawing air down from this 450 meter or 1,500 foot tall or 100-story tall building tall television station tower that sticks into wind. And it allows us to do things with my colleagues at NOAA in Boulder to, one, directly measure with accuracy of around 0.2 parts per million carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, which since we started measuring in 1995 has steadily gone up at the same rate that it does globally everywhere. And you may be more familiar with some of those curves, for example, from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. One of the big differences you see here, though, is that notice that over the course of 1 year, you can have CO2 as high in any 1 year as like 500 to 600 parts per million, whereas our background average today is around 400. And even in modern times, we can get in the middle of the day in the summer, CO2 down to like 360 parts per million. That is the strong and dramatic influence of vegetation on the carbon cycle because of the impact of photosynthesis and growth, and then senescence in the fall. And so while the growth rate is constrained by fossil fuel emissions, these little differences from year to year, those ups and downs and wiggles, tells us a lot about what's happening with vegetation. And when it comes to the carbon cycle, we can directly measure through technology that I'll talk about in a few slides, how much CO2 is going into plants and how much is being lost from one year to the next. And so we do that on this tower with instruments that we also have on the tall tower. And one of the things we've discovered at this site, for example, is over 25 years, the site has gone on net from giving up carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So even though this is a productive forest with a lot of wetlands interspersed, into something that's become more productive with time, but with high interannual variability. This slide is one I give to the general public, and so it's in tons per acre here. But the idea here is that we are embarking on a large change in the atmosphere, and that's influencing ecosystems, and then influenced ecosystems are then themselves influencing the atmosphere, both in the carbon cycle and in the energy budget. Of course, it's not just CO2 increase as plants become more productive. We're also under a period of increasing climate extremes and pressures. And so whether that's something like the eucalyptus forest burning across Australia about 1 year ago from today, and so here's a picture near New South Wales, near Sydney, or whether it's something more subtle but widespread once it gets spreads out. This might be blurry on your screen. This is a picture I took from a very bumpy aircraft flying at very low altitude in the Fraser Experimental Forest in Colorado. And if you look closely, you'll notice that not all the trees are as green as the others. These are all lodgepole pine trees, but what's actually occurring in this forest is going from it's gone from 10 to 90% dead in the course of a decade. And so in this particular period, it was about 40% dead. This was during my postdoc in Boulder, Colorado. And this is a outbreak of the mountain pine bark beetle, which is an endogenous endemic species, but because of climate warming in winters has allowed to spread to greater areas and has led to widespread mortality in a lot of ecosystems across the Rocky Mountains. And what we were doing in this plane was essentially treating this like a giant chamber where we were measuring CO2 in and out of this while trying very much not to throw up on the plane, which was fun. But I'm going to focus today just on this one location in Wisconsin. So this is a view again of that tall tower sticking there in the wind. And I've been working out here for 2 decades, back through my graduate student days into my role as a faculty member at UW. And we've worked with a number of partners, and one of the things that I often like to say is that sometimes, as scientists, we like to go out and go to exotic locations and make measurements in places we haven't been before. But sometimes just staring at one place for a long time and trying to look at it from different angles can give us as much information about a scientific question. And so this nice quote from Marcel Proust: "The true journey of discovery is not in seeing new landscape, but in developing new eyes." And of course, there's been lots of eyes on this particular landscape, of course, going back all the way to the indigenous folks who have lived here and whose land this belongs to originally, and that's the Ojibwe and the Chippewa, and into the scientists who pioneered a lot of the measurement, the work, the people I've worked with over the years, including folks at Penn State and at NOAA, my colleague Arlen Andrews, who made those CO2 measurements I showed you a few slides ago, and my own lab as well. So what are we doing out here in detail? Well, one of the technologies we use to directly measure the amount of energy, sensible and latent heating, as well as the CO2 uptake, is this idea called eddy covariance. So eddy covariance is a technology that goes back a ways, and the basic idea is that we stick instruments out into the wind on these booms, and we have one here that's measuring winds at high frequency in 3 dimensions, and then something that's sucking air back in here into a gas analyzer. And the idea of this is that if you think about the atmosphere is always a turbulent fluid, right? So even if a small gust of wind, you're going to have all these eddies mixing air around. And because of the friction of Earth's surface and the heating of the Earth's surface, you're going to generate thermals and you're going to generate shear friction that's going to then generate eddies that can transport, in this kind of Wikipedia diagram, water, heat, and tracers like carbon dioxide or trace gases across. And if I have a tower sticking in this wind and I have instruments where I can directly measure the intensity of that turbulent air to how fast is air going up or down, and if I know exactly the difference in how much CO2 or water or temperature is in that air as it's moving past and as it going up or down, the covariance of the two, or multiplying the fluctuations of those two values at the time scale of roughly 20 times per second, will tell me on net whether we have heat going up into the atmosphere or heat going into the earth, or water going out of into the atmosphere, or water being condensed, and the same thing with heat. This is not new technology per se, but the ability to what we can do today is relatively new. So there's been lots of folks have been involved in eddy covariance or flux science. The theoretical work goes all the way back into the 19th century. But even in the mid 20th century, some of the pioneering measurements, some of which occurred in the Soviet Union, and so wasn't really merged with some of the work going on in Australia and in Europe and the US until the 1960s and 70s. And it wasn't until we had reliable infrared gas analyzers and technology to directly measure that it really came to be that we started building these networks of flux towers where we can directly measure CO2 flux for long periods of time. The advent of data loggers and telemetry and cellular networks then allowed us to kind of get to global syntheses where we are today. And this crowdsourced paper tried to estimate how many of these flux towers are out there. While a number of them are part of global networks like Ameriflux and FluxNet and Neon and so forth, there are many others that are just sharing data that are out there for part of different projects. And so this project argued there's roughly about 3,000 or so flux towers that are out there measuring these fluxes. And there's a lot of really cool questions we could ask by bringing these together. So let's go back to my little tiny spot. So I've been running a number of eddy covariance flux towers. Here they are, known by their acronyms or license plates, I guess. In forests, wetlands, and lakes in northern Wisconsin. Here we are in Chequamegon. In farms in central Wisconsin more recently, and then also some work in lake systems and urban systems at my home campus in Madison, as well as in the North Temperate Lakes LTER site located in the northern highlands of Wisconsin. And I also have one site in the UP outside the Watersmeet area and near the Sylvania Wilderness. That's the site I built for my PhD. So that one is my baby. And if you want to talk about the travails of building flux towers and what it takes to be a certified tower climber as I am, come talk to me. It's fun and grueling work, except I hate mosquitoes with a passion now. So what we do at these sites is we directly monitor CO2, water, and heat. We've been spending a lot of time building these towers. It's pretty fun work. It's very collaborative work. Involves a lot of kind of engineering of making these towers that can measure these things, instrumentation and data loggers. But to be honest, these days, most of the work is really done by my lab. And so I do need to give credit to that most of the slides from this point onward are coming from the folks in my lab. This is just a picture from a year and a half ago now when we could gather at a diner close to campus in Madison, have a number of grad students, postdocs, and technicians here from all parts of the world. So often when I use this slide in public talks and say, what does a climate scientist look like? This is what climate scientists look like. They're from places like Indonesia and China and India and Germany, from California and New York and Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I really am lucky to have these great graduate students and postdocs who have been spending time in the lab over the years, really plugging away at some really messy problems. So I'm going to talk about one interesting problem with these flux towers. So we talked about the importance of the surface energy balance and how plants on land have a strong impact on it. So we can measure all the components of the surface energy balance from these eddy covariance flux towers because we can directly measure sensible and latent heat fluxes from the instruments I just described. And we can use other instruments called radiometers to measure the amount of energy coming in from the sun and the amount of energy being lost by infrared radiation. And so here's a picture of that site in the UP in outside of Watersmeet. And this is a site called Sylvania Wilderness. It's looking out at old growth hemlocks. So this is an infrared gas analyzer. The thing, the claw-like arms there is a sonic anemometer. It uses speed of sound measurements at 60 times a second to infer vertical and horizontal wind velocities. And then we have some radiometers on it. So I just took some data from this and averaged it up so that we can kind of see where we're going. So first, we can measure sunlight. That's not too hard. So here it is over the course of a year, the average daily amount of sunlight coming in and sunlight reflected. Sorry, this is a growing season. And this is in local time, so 12 here is in noon. So sun comes up, sun goes down, and some of that light is reflected. Most of it is absorbed by Earth's surface. We can also measure then the infrared radiation, right? So we have some amount of long wave, what's another word for infrared light, coming in, that's coming in from the sky. Sky has a temperature, it has greenhouse gases, it's going to emit infrared temperature, and then clouds in particular are also going to be strong infrared emitters. And so all of those are then hitting down to the surface. That's part of the so-called greenhouse effect. And then the surface itself heats up, and as it heats up, it's going to give more infrared radiation back to the atmosphere, and that's called long wave emitted. So if I take those 4 terms and I subtract solar in from out and long wave in from out and add those 2 together, I get something called net radiation, right? That's the net available electromagnetic energy available to our surface, okay? That's not too bad, right? So it's negative at night because at night the surface cools, and in the daytime we're getting more energy than we're losing. So on average, the surface is going to heat up. Okay, that's net radiation. All right, so what happens to that energy? Well, a small piece of it goes into heating up the soil below the surface, right? The surface we're going to assume is infinitesimally thin in this kind of theoretical example. So we have energy going into the soil at day, and then the soil is maybe giving some energy back out to the near surface at night. And we call that ground heat flux or storage. All right, from our tower, we can directly then measure so-called latent heat flux, which is, as I said, a fancy word for evapotranspiration, or the amount of energy being used to evaporate water from the surface through plants and out those stomates. And it's called latent because the heating happens later as that water recondenses somewhere back in the atmosphere as a cloud, and that's when you then release that heat. So latent is kind of like hidden. Sensible heat flux is heat because it's not because it's average or sensible, but really because you can feel it, right? It's the heating of the ground and the ground conducting heat into the air, generating convection. So you can see in this site, we have a nice diurnal cycle of those 2. In theory, these are the only terms of the energy balance at the surface, and therefore the sum of these should equal net radiation. So let's find out if it does. If we do that, it doesn't, right? So if we take the net radiation and we take away the amount of energy that's going into the ground below it, and we compare it to the amount of energy that's going into our sensible and latent heat fluxes and storage of heat in the air, these 2 curves are not on top of each other. And this is not just true on the average, this is true for just about every single half hour of measurement we make. We make these fluxes at 10 times a second, and we sum them up to half hour of the average fluxes. So I have 17,000 data points or so per year. If I plot a one-to-one line, every once in a while, we do kind of overestimate the energy budget, but most of the time we don't. And as long as the first law of thermodynamics is true and energy is conserved, it's a pretty good law. It seems like it's held up. Then something is wrong, right? Because if I fit a line through this, I'm only capturing 75% of the energy from these towers, and that's problematic. Now, you could argue that I'm just a bad tower builder and I'm not really good at building flux towers and I should be kicked out of Ameriflux. And that's been maybe brought up once or twice, but it turns out that that's not entirely the case. It's just my postdoc, David Reid, who's now a faculty member at the Oklahoma School of Science and Art, did this global analysis of all those towers you saw a few slides ago in that big picture. And this, just look at the lines here. This is season, so day of year, relative to that slope. Like I saw, remember that slope was 0.74 on the last slide? And what's shown here is northern hemisphere sites in black and southern hemisphere sites in gray. And the main story here is that no matter where you are in the world, no matter which flux tower you build, none of them reach 1. They all are less than 1, and they have seasonality to it too. So it's better sometimes of the year than the other. So what's going on? So this has been a problem that people have talked about for several decades. And there's been a number of things proposed. So one is like, well, okay, well, some of that energy goes into actually heating the water and air immediately below our tower. Remember, our tower is above the canopy. We build these towers at roughly 100 feet in the case of a forest, or maybe 10 or 20 feet above, say, a wetland or a grassland. And so we can measure that by having multiple measurements of temperature and humidity with height on the tower. So we do that at our sites. And that's some of it, but that doesn't explain everything. We can also look at things like, well, some of that heating goes into actually heating the stem of trees. And that's like 1%, 2%. We've actually done this where we've measured tree temperature at dozens of spots. I'll show you one slide from that later. Some of that energy, of course, goes into photosynthesis. You can estimate that based on the biokinetics and the kinetics of photosynthesis and the area of leaves. That's like 2%. Some of that does go into phase change in the soil. That's like 1%. It doesn't explain it, right? So what else could there be? So my colleague Paul Stoy, who is now a faculty member at UW-Madison, had this great paper in 2013 where what he looked at was that same slope, energy balance closure as we're calling it here, relative to how variable is the greenness beyond my tower. So not within the tower's view shed itself. So the tower has something we call a footprint, which is on the order of roughly a kilometer. So a kilometer square around, or a kilometer circle around the tower in the predominant wind direction is mostly what that flux is representative of. It's the only technology we have out there to do ecosystem scale fluxes. But if you look beyond that, which shouldn't actually influence the flux measurement, the more variable the greenness is, the more heterogeneous the world is around it beyond the tower, the worse the energy balance closure is. It's like, well, that's interesting. So it turns out there's some theoretical support for that. My colleague Matthias Mauter at KIT in Germany has published a paper in 2008, and there's been some follow-ons where they used a computer model, so called large eddy simulations, where they put simulated towers in them. And what they can show is that in many cases, regardless of where you put the tower, these so-called large-scale eddies, these eddies that actually transpire over the entire boundary layer and mix in warm, dry air that's usually above the boundary layer into there, and that tend to be stationary, especially when you have heterogeneity on the surface, can be the generation. And because of the way we compute fluxes, we do these on half-hourly to 1-hour time steps, we actually don't see these things transpire or move past our tower, and therefore we actually undersample this eddy. So that's a theory. The challenge is it's really hard to measure because, well, yeah, we could be like, we could measure for 3 hours instead. But the problem is that over 3 hours, the surface is changing. The amount of water that's going out, the amount of heat that's changing, the photosynthesis is all changing. So it's not a stationary problem. And stationarity is one of our key assumptions when we compute fluxes this way. And the idea here is that if you have enough heterogeneity where you have warm, dry versus cold, wet patches, you might generate the right kind of structures in the atmosphere that produce these types of eddies. And these eddies are then the cause of our missing energy. Okay. So let's take a little pause here because I just introduced a lot of terms that might be new to some of you. Okay, so remember, net radiation, right, is the available energy at the surface. And we're going to turn that RNet. H is the sensible heat flux, or the heating of the atmosphere by thermals. LE, or latent heat flux, is heating by evaporation and transpiration. We're going to introduce a new term that we're going to see, which is if I divide those two numbers, H over LE, we call that the Bowen ratio. And so keep that one in mind. And then remember, we've introduced energy balance. The available energy and the used energy do not equal each other, and that fraction varies from 0 to 1, and 1 is what we want. Okay, so how does that lead to this? I think most people in this room know what a Green Bay Packer is. When I give this talk to international audiences, though I do need to sometimes introduce that in Wisconsin, and I think there's a lot of Packer fans up here too, we seem to have this team that wears hats made out of foam cheese blocks. And as a result, I decided to do a study a couple years ago that was named after that, called the Cheesehead Study. And that stands for the Chequamegon Heterogeneous Ecosystem Energy Balance Study enabled by a high-density extensive array of detectors. And if I knew that I was going to have to say that, I would have given it a shorter name. But here's a view looking down at the tower, pretty fun. The idea of this was, what if we could look at that landscape around that tall tower in a new way? And what if we could be out there and extensively measure everything that's going on in the surface and the atmosphere in as many places as possible in some sort of 10 by 10 square kilometer box? So kind of the size of a single weather model or a grid box, or a super high resolution climate model grid box. The idea is that we really want to be able to bring in models to this question. And so we want to kind of sample things in a way that a model might see it as well, so we can kind of merge. Models conserve the energy balance. These measurements don't. That makes comparing measurements and models also a problem. And then we decided that we needed measurements out here for about 4 months or so in 2019. And the reason we did that is that we wanted to be out there from when everything was green and lush to when things were starting to be senescent. And since you live in this landscape and climate, you're pretty familiar with how that works around here. But consider here, this is the latent and sensible heat fluxes for a wetland site and a forest site. And you can see here in July, regardless of what ecosystem you have, they pretty much are all latent heat flux dominated. And so there's a lot of homogeneity in the energy balance. All these ecosystems here are not moisture limited, so they're adapted to use as much moisture as they can so they can take up as much carbon as they can for this relatively short growing season we have. And then sometime by September, October, we start to lose leaves in the forest. And so the forest actually becomes sensible heat flux dominated. While the wetlands kind of keep doing their own thing. The net radiation is smaller, so the total is smaller, but kind of the Bowen ratio of these two is roughly the same. So you actually start generating more heterogeneity. And in theory, we have a natural experiment where we can go from homogeneous to heterogeneous landscape and ask, does that actually then generate the mesoscale circulations, these eddies that I talked about, that are the cause of our energy balance problem? This was a relatively large project, mostly supported by the National Science Foundation, or large for me at least. But we had some funding from the folks in Germany, from Matthias Mauder's group, as I mentioned, as well as a number of instrumentation partners. We had several groups coming and helping us out from other universities, as well as a high school and a middle school group nearby that helped us collect some additional measurements and had teachers who received some training on environmental science, which was a really fun part of this experiment. Pictures of everyone, lots of good people involved. It was really fun. We had about 45 people in the field, about 70 total involved in some way or another. We had funding to upgrade instruments on the tower. So here's a professional tower climber we hired to bring up some new sonic anemometers. And then we did something crazy, which has never really been done before, which was deploy as many flux towers as possible. And we worked at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which often does these storm chasing type studies, et cetera, to deploy 19 eddy covariance flux towers around that tall tower. 19 towers is a lot. It's the highest density towers ever done in the world for a single experiment. It replicates all the major vegetation types in one 10 by 10 kilometer area. And we use mostly these fold-up towers. And what makes the study even more unique is that instead of picking like the perfect sites where we, as ecologists, we like to go to pretty spots, we like to go to things that are intact forests, et cetera. We actually randomly selected sites subject to several constraints, like it had to be in land we could permit, so mostly to Forest Service. It had to be close enough to a road that we could actually drive in these towers, et cetera. But we used a random generator algorithm to help us select sites. And so we deployed these all around the tower in a variety of wetlands and forests and even 2 lakes. On top of that, we added some measurements of the atmosphere. So we used a variety of what are known as in situ remote sensing from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and a group at NOAA, who would make very careful measurements of the radiation budget, of the atmospheric profiles with things called SODAR, which are sound detection, RAS, which uses radar, ceilometers, which send laser pulses, microwave radiometers that use microwave pulses for water vapor, as well as several LIDARs that can measure winds using the Doppler effect. And then we also launched things like traditional weather balloons. So here's one of our undergrads, James, demonstrating weather balloons. We then brought out a whole bunch of things to measure heterogeneity on the surface. So we had a group that was flying drones to measure the complexity of canopy around the tower at 1 centimeter resolution. We had a variety of other drones measuring land surface temperature, as well as hyperspectral imaging through a Cessna aircraft that could measure at roughly from 400 to 2500 nanometer at 3 nanometer wavelength resolution, at 1 meter resolution, all the vegetation. And then we also had this aircraft called the University of Wyoming King Air. The King Air is an eddy covariance flux tower on a plane. And so the cool thing about that is that if there really is these standing eddies that are being generated that are not going past the tower, well, if we have a plane, we could actually just fly through them. And so that's what we did. We spent about 80 hours on this plane going back and forth over 3 one-week periods in the summer and in the fall, measuring eddy fluxes at 100 meters above ground, or about 60 to 70 meters above the trees. Much lower than FAA allowed minimums, but certainly were certainly doable. And we take all these measurements. So my postdoc, Brian Butterworth, just published a paper in the Bulletin of the AMS, American Meteorological Society, and he's a great graphic artist. So he's got these nice diagrams showing all the measurements and how they kind of come together. So what did we learn? So this is just the so-called footprint or the view shed of each of these towers. So you can see that over the course of the summer, we've kind of intensively were able to measure fluxes from a lot of portions of the landscape. And if we just look at the raw data, here's the daily sensible and latent heat fluxes. Here's that Bowen ratio I mentioned. There's nothing that sticks out right away. Right. One is there's lots of variability by land cover type. So the colors here represent different ecosystems. We do see the Bowen ratio increasing with time, as well as the variability to Bowen ratio increasing with time. So that would be consistent with our idea that we're getting more heterogeneous as we get into the fall, and we're getting to some more sites having higher and lower sensible heat fluxes, whereas in the summer we had more consistency on that. So we can ask, did we do a better job? These are the National Center for Atmospheric Research. They do a really good job calibrating all their instruments. They do a really good job making sure they measure everything right. And we still fail to close the energy balance. But it varies a lot by site. So you notice that each site, the yellow in this pie chart is the energy balance closure ratio, or how much of the energy is missing relative to the net radiation and the latent and sensible heat flux. And you can see it varies quite a bit, and there's not really a clear pattern when you look at it this way. Well, let's look at all the sites at once first. And you can see the net radiation variability. So if we just look at that relative to the sensible and latent heat fluxes and the residual, you can see the residual seems to peak in the middle of the day. That seems very consistent with what we know. And that diurnal cycle is very common at all the sites. Regardless of the site, you still have that peak energy balance residual in absolute units here, kind of around noon or about 18 UTC. So that's about 12 Central Time. So we also did some of the same things. We asked, okay, well, can we explain this? So we worked with the high school group as well as a high school intern who deployed all these tree temperature sensors for us at a number of sites. And we tried to estimate biomass heat storage. We combined that with the LiDAR data from the drones to estimate the amount of biomass. And we get some really rough estimates that show that, yeah, there is some of these sites, biomass heat storage can be really large, but it's not going to explain the energy balance residual. There's also some theories out in the literature that suggest that the canopy structure within itself can generate kind of small scale flows or drainage flows, as we call them, gravity driven flows across the topography. And so we used the drone imagery. So these are these beautiful images taken by Christian Anderson, a faculty member at UW-Madison, who flew these drones around these towers. I'm fascinated by these images. They're so fun to look at. And what we did here is we just estimated a really simple estimate of canopy complexity. So here, the standard deviation of vegetation height relative to that slope. And there's a little bit, the more messy sites, the more sites with heterogeneity do have worse closure, but it's not a really strong slope. And so it doesn't explain everything. So now we get to the fun part, right? So here we have those Doppler LiDARs looking at wind direction and wind and vertical wind. And here we have an aerosol LiDAR that shows the amount of aerosols in the atmosphere. And one of the things I want to point at is this period here where we have the maximum energy balance residual is also when you see the largest changes from red to blue to red to blue to red to blue across the entire lower first kilometer of the atmosphere. That is mesoscale eddies, because that's updrafts and downdrafts that are over the entire boundary layer. And you can see that these updrafts and downdrafts actually by the afternoon then promote the development of these super red spikes in the aerosols. Those are clouds. So cloud development then basically occurs as a result of this intense turbulence that's occurring around mid-afternoon. That's a very common summer pattern, right? We generate lots of puffy afternoon cumulus clouds after a morning that's often more clear. Okay, so maybe there's something to these. Can we actually measure how intense these mesoscale eddies are? So Brian, the postdoc, came up with this simple index where he took that Doppler wind LiDAR data and estimated a kind of a period and amplitude of the wavelength of those ups and downs. And then he compared that to the energy balance residual. And there's actually a really tight relationship. It was actually pretty exciting when he first showed this. Now you might say, well, wait a second. I'm always skeptical when relationships look too good. The color here tells you the net radiation value. And you can see here that some of this is just because the sites have low net radiation translates to low energy balance residual, and high net radiation translates to high residual. But what's encouraging is that if you look within each binned subset of net radiation, you do see that there's a consistent slope. And that slope leads to roughly the same amount of missing energy, around 50 watts per square meter. So not everything, but that's a pretty good indication that this idea of mesoscale eddies in the middle of summer are the ones driving it. Now, what's counter to this is that I was expecting to see this more in the autumn when we had greater heterogeneity, but that's not what we saw. And so I'm still a little bit puzzled about what's actually driving this, but it does seem to be that these eddies exist, that they can explain the energy balance residual. And I'm going to show you in the last 10 minutes or so exactly how we might do that. So here's just an video I took from the aircraft, and I'm very proud as being the only team member on this experiment who did not throw up on this flight. But these are the things that we take. And so you can see this is October or September, I think, and you can see the variability in the landscape and the lakes. And the cool thing we can do with airborne fluxes is we can calculate fluxes using something called a wavelet technique. So instead of doing temporal legs, each leg we can actually then decompose into the small scale and large scale contribution to the eddy covariance. So we call that the turbulence in blue or the mesoscale in orange. And my PhD student, Srinath Polari, has been spending his time working on generating estimates of the contribution of mesoscale. So the nice thing about the plane is because we're flying through those eddies, we can incorporate them into our calculation if we use this wavelet-based computation method, and we can estimate how much energy actually is there in these eddies. Now, what we can't do in the plane is estimate the leg length net radiation, because that's a little bit trickier. But so we can't actually say, does this fully close the energy balance? But this does allow us to get an estimate across 3 different times of the year, the relative proportion of these mesoscale eddy generations and their energy effect. And you can see here that in the fall, even though net radiation is lower, it can be, in the case of water vapor, a larger fraction of the flux. Now, one thing you might be asking if you're more of a biogeochemist is like, well, does this mean that eddy flux towers are bad at measuring carbon fluxes too? And the question is probably not. And I should point out, all of this matters at kind of the hour-to-hour scale. And a lot of the work that people have done with fluxes has been at the daily to seasonal to annual scale, where some of this does average out. But at least in this initial study, this is from a week ago now, it does suggest that there are actually, we may be underestimating the magnitude of photosynthesis, at least for these flights that we've measured this mesoscale contribution. Where here, the more negative the number is, the more CO2 is going into plants relative to the atmosphere. So this is called net ecosystem exchange. So what we've been trying to do is figure out ways we could incorporate that information into calculation of fluxes so we can solve this problem for good. And so what we've done is in the literature, there are a couple different ways you could calculate eddy fluxes. So the regular way is what I call the temporal method. For each tower, we calculate mean vertical velocities and concentrations from 30-minute averages, and then we do the covariance of those two values, essentially multiplying the two numbers together after you take out the average. But if I have multiple towers, and people have shown this in large eddy simulations that it works, then we might be able to use multiple towers to estimate kind of a spatial mean vertical velocity, and that might help capture that stationary eddy impact. Now, the problem is these eddies are not truly fully stationary. They actually do slowly move. And they're not unlike necessarily lake effect snow bands in the way they move and propagate. And so there's another method out there called the space-time method, where you calculate, this requires really good time coordination across all the towers. They all have to be synced in time. And in this case, I think we had it. And so we can relax this assumption a little bit and get down to like 1 minute averaging across towers. But in theory, that allows us to capture both non-stationary and stationary. And when we do that, we see that evapotranspiration from the temporal to the spatial to the space-time always, in all cases, increases the magnitude of both the latent and sensible heat flux in a way that better captures about half of the energy balance closure. So here's the energy balance residual shown in temporal, where it's the worst, spatial, where it's a little bit better, and space-time, where there's still a residual, but we seem to have captured a chunk of it. So what does this all mean? Well, one thing is, as micrometeorologists, we've spent a lot of time developing eddy covariance, and carbon cycle scientists and hydrologists and ecohydrologists and others have spent a lot of time using flux towers to advance questions on the science. And the problem is that we've often kind of swept this problem under the rug. A lot of times you have to write a paper and be like, oh yeah, there's also energy balance, and there's a couple correction methods that are out there. The FluxNet data product corrects the sensible and latent heat fluxes in an empirical way. But the truth is, energy balance closure is a symptom of eddy covariance assumptions, and it's ubiquitous. However, I like to view this not as a problem, but that needs correction, but as an opportunity, right? So in this case, we actually use the energy balance closure to understand atmospheric structure. And so we can use these wavelet-based approaches to estimate mesoscale dispersive fluxes. We can use canopy complexity measurements to understand how biodiversity, for example, and species mix can change energy partitioning in Earth's atmosphere, and how these different emissions of different plants influence atmospheric circulations. So what we're doing now is using really high resolution computer simulations, so these large eddy simulations, and new scaling methods to develop corrected maps of surface energy and carbon fluxes as a test bed that we hope can eventually lead to a more appropriate correction for the fluxes that have already been processed by those thousands of towers. So this is what Srinath is doing with his colleague, Louise Vonner, who's a PhD student in Germany. And the effect of the two of these, what they're working on together is they've gotten 8 million core hours of time on the National Center for Atmospheric Research supercomputer, and are running something that's not normally done with large eddy simulations, which is a realistic large eddy simulation over a 36 by 36 kilometer gradient down to 6-meter resolution at the finest grid scale. And the idea here is that we're going to simulate the experiment in both July and in October, so both the homogeneous and heterogeneous case, and actually sample this LES like the towers and aircraft that we're flying through, using a realistic plant canopy module where we can actually have leaf area density profiles and things like that to allow for that canopy complexity to be done in. And then we can do things like compare it to those airborne fluxes. So this is a map called a flux topography that's generated by using the aircraft and its viewshed footprint model and surface covariance. And we can actually kind of look at the structure of this, because we know the model is not going to directly match observations given the way that this works. But what we can look for is, do we get the same spatial structure and patterns in the model as we do in the observations? And then if we can trust the model, can we use that to diagnose and test a couple correction methods for eddy covariance towers? We've done some initial tests. So Louisa in particular has run the LES with just kind of a single vegetation type. So here we have a meadow versus a forest. And we have 3 panels here of increasing level of instability, or more convection, more thermals and eddies. And as you do that, you'll notice that in the deforested or the more complex ecosystem, you have much more of this red, that's vertical velocity. So these are really strong updrafts generated in these kind of hexagonal patterns. It's very commonly seen in lots of convective flows. But you can see that compared to the meadow, the forest generates many more of these and are much more intense. And our idea is that if you put these two together, you're going to start generating hotspots in the atmosphere. You're going to generate these mesoscale eddies that then can be persistent. So that's what we're hoping to get to. I'm happy to chat with anyone down the road. I'm here till the end of June. If you want to push on this, all of this data is public and open access. Most of it's already been published. So please come and use our data, steal our data. The carbon fluxes, water fluxes, atmospheric circulations. We've also made some ecophysiology measurements. We have lots of some chamber measurements, some soil mineralogy, leaf spectra, leaf photosynthesis, things that might be useful to your work. Happy for any of you to come use it. Read the paper in BAMS if you want to know more details of what the measurements are made, or go to cheesehead19.org. So with that, I'm going to quit and hopefully maybe leave a little bit of time for questions. So thank you. You can reach me out at this email address. Actually, I now have an MTU address, so you can try that one too. And my website or my Twitter, which you're welcome to also read and connect to. And of course, I want to acknowledge the numerous funders that are involved in here, including the Ameriflux project, which funds the core site Flux towers, through the Department of Energy, as well as the Cheesehead of the National Science Foundation, as well as the LTER site, and my colleagues at NOAA, the Forest Service, USGS, Wisconsin Educational Communications Board, which operates the tower as part of the state of Wisconsin. It's actually a PBS station, as well as some of the landowners and some of the aircraft owners. So with that, I think.
Great, great, excuse me. Thank you for that wonderful and really interesting seminar. We do have time for some questions for Dr. Desai.
Ankur, this is Noel. Thanks, really enjoyed that. Had a couple of questions. I mean, it looks as if you've only accounted for about 1/3 of the energy imbalance. What do you think the remaining 2/3 is?
That's a good question. Of course, what I showed there was a summary. And one of the things we're still breaking down in our next paper is really at some of the sites, it does a lot better than that. And at others, it does worse. A piece of this is a couple of interesting quality control steps that we still need to take. And one is, when you build a tower, you try as hard as you can to make everything level with ground. So 2 questions come to mind. Well, what exactly is level? Because ground is never truly that flat. And is it level with the canopy top or with the surface or some hypothetical atmospheric surface? So I've had long conversations with my colleague Stefan Metzger about that. And so that's called rotation. We've tried there's one type of rotation we can try that might help solve some of this. And then the other piece of this is that there could be some that the spatial temporal method, when we do it in a large eddy simulation, we get much closer. And some of that is because the measurements are perfect. And so there's some question of how much is noise, how much is our assumptions and our temporal affecting that measurement. And that's something that we're still working on, or to be more honest, is what Brian is working on. And then the other thing is that we've tried another method, which I didn't have time to get into in this talk, called the environmental response function method. And that is also dealing with the fact that I kind of glanced over this, but the flux tower, right, from 1 hour to the next samples a slightly different footprint, right? And so in theory, we assume that our footprints are homogeneous, right? That no matter which way the wind is blowing from the tower, we're seeing the same stuff. But that rarely is true. And what we've shown in the ERF method is that even in 1/2 an hour time step, if you look from 1 minute to the next, you sample slightly different landscapes. And if you have good enough models of that footprint, you might actually be able to kind of re-rectify the flux measurement. And so my former PhD student, Shu, she had a paper out a couple years ago where she did that with the tall tower data. And in that one, she also closed the energy balance remarkably well, almost too good. And so I've been skeptical of it for a long time. But the idea there is that part of that is that heterogeneity, you can actually account for like different land surfaces. And that's actually going to do a better job of capturing the true net radiation balance as well as the true energy balance.
And then my second question was, what's the implication for the carbon balance? I mean, is it regardless of which direction the carbon flux is that you're underestimating it?
Yeah, so this has been an interesting question because for a long time, people have kind of argued, okay, well, the energy balance is an energy balance thing, and it's maybe because we can't measure water vapor really well, et cetera. And so therefore it shouldn't have an effect on CO2 uptake. And in theory, right, the difference between CO2 and water and heat is that water and heat have persistent large gradients at the top of the boundary layer. And so you're always going to be mixing in this warm, dry air from aloft in the middle of the day in a convective boundary layer. Whereas CO2, at least beyond, once you get above the immediate surface where you have those huge gradients in photosynthesis-driven CO2, is relatively well mixed. So the theory has always been, well, as long as that's well mixed, if you do have even these large eddies, they're not going to contribute to the flux. Now, that initial plot that Srinath showed me of the CO2 flux shocked me because it suggests that it did. And I don't know what that means. The other thing that's weird about CO2 flux is that CO2 flux has traditionally always been thought of a much bigger problem at night. Because at nighttime, eddy covariance towers have lots of issues because you don't have the same level of turbulence. Turbulence is much more intermittent. You have these stable conditions, so often a lot of any emissions coming out of the soil are going to kind of slowly, kind of gravitationally go downhill. And so you're going to miss some of these. And so traditionally the idea is that people have generally expected that we underestimate respiratory nighttime fluxes when you don't have photosynthesis, and that we do a pretty good job in daytime. And that's explaining why often eddy covariance towers often show much larger carbon sinks than what we see when you do traditional NPP and chamber respiration type measurements. But if this is true, then it might be almost it kind of works in the opposite direction, which is kind of, because at least here would suggest that we're actually seeing higher CO2 fluxes or the CO2 fluxes are actually higher than what we're measuring. And it kind of makes sense if CO2 is higher above the boundary layer and you have a negative vertical velocity times a higher CO2 flux, that's a negative flux into the surface. I don't know what that means yet. That's a really interesting question.
Thanks. Yeah, it would be fun to talk.
Yeah.
Hi, Ankur. This is Judith Perlinger. And Noel you answered my question about nighttime flux measurement.
Yeah.
But isn't there also, I had a question related to the energy balance. Isn't there supposed to be a storage term on one side or the other? And where did that go? Right,
yeah, so there is a storage flux term, right? So if you look at the traditional way to derive like an eddy covariance flux budget is kind of take this control volume approach where you kind of put a box around your ecosystem and you think of all of the flows and then you make some assumptions for which terms are small. And so we throw out some of these advective terms, which in theory are also coming back into these mesoscale terms. The storage flux, right, is that below sensor height, you're going to have heating and evaporation or cooling and the condensation. And what we typically do at tall towers is we measure multiple heights, temperature and humidity, and we integrate that with time. And we do that at our tall sites. We don't do it at our short sites. And what we typically find is that number is relatively small, and it doesn't explain the energy balance, but we do include them in the plots I showed here. I just kind of skipped a step. And it also averages to 0 roughly in 2 to 3 days. So it wouldn't explain a persistent bias, which we still see when we average things out sometimes. So that's where we are with storage fluxes. Now, there are some suggestions that storage fluxes can be large for certain ecosystems, especially during transition time. So in the morning and in the evening, when you switch from more stable to unstable conditions and vice versa. Then you often see these bursting or venting type events. And those are easy to skip or miss in your kind of half-hourly average type measurements. And so we have been playing around with kind of shorter term measurements, non-stationary measurements, and occasionally you pick up some larger terms during then. But during the middle of the day when things are well mixed, it's pretty quasi-stationary. That kind of, you don't see a lot of change in storage. And that's when you see the largest energy balance closure, imbalance.
Okay. All right, that's clearer now. And actually going back to that question about the nighttime measurements, are your tall towers usually above the top of the stable boundary layer?
That's a good question. So most towers and most eddy covariance flux towers are usually just a handful of meters above the canopy height. And in those cases, generally most of them are in the nocturnal stable layer. We diagnose that by looking at a couple of turbulent variables. So often people calculate friction velocity because you can do that with a sonic anemometer by looking at the covariance of vertical and horizontal winds. And there's a standardized method now to throw out data when U star is low or friction velocity is low. And so what happens is low turbulence conditions are kind of screened out. And that actually gets rid of like 20 to 30% of nighttime data or more at most sites. And you can see that in the data, and the fluxes go down. The very tall tower is a unique site. There's really not a lot of other flux towers like that. And I kind of skipped over some of the technical details, but we measure fluxes at 3 heights on that tower, at 30 meters, 120 meters, and at 400 meters. And we kind of had this algorithm that was published in 2001 from my PhD advisor's lab, where we use the highest height that's in the boundary layer based on kind of an estimate of the sensible heat flux during the day. And then at night, we look at the sign of the sensible heat flux and we take one of the lower layers, and then we still use that U star correction. It seems to do an okay job, and because we're also, in that case, the storage flux that we just mentioned is a large term. And so we do have to account for the storage flux at the tall tower. And thankfully we have NOAA making really good CO2 measurements for us. And so we can just take their measurements that are measured at multiple heights and integrate that. But yeah, nighttime is like I can give a whole nother hour-long talk about eddy covariance at night. And that one, for water fluxes, it's not a big deal because latent heat flux is essentially 0 at night. But for CO2 fluxes, it's a big deal because when people try to estimate photosynthesis from flux towers, you're assuming there's no photosynthesis at night, and you're fitting a curve to your nighttime data to estimate respiratory fluxes during the day. And that could lead to biases. And there's been lots of work of trying to kind of get around that. It's called flux partitioning. There's a bazillion papers on different methodologies around that. And when people take traditional chamber-based measurements, at a lot of sites, the chamber fluxes are larger than the eddy fluxes at night, or the respiration fluxes they infer. But at a handful of sites, it's not. And so that's been a puzzle too. And we had a couple of theories, and I've tried 3 times to get funding for some really cool studies to like solve that with like transects made in the middle of the night and stuff. But someday we're going to get funding because we have a couple ideas of how we might be able to go after that one too.
Okay, well, I would like to determine the boundary layer height from SOAS study data. So I'll come and ask you about that.
Well, folks, we're just about out of time here. So again, thank you, Ankur, for that wonderful seminar. And just a couple of business items. Next week, a graduate student in the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department, Enid Partika, will be presenting about, giving a seminar about her previous research involving biodigestion. Reminder to please contact Professor Eric Seagren if you would like to get credit for your continuing education by participating in the seminar series. And a final reminder that if you want to revisit the seminar or share it with colleagues, it is being recorded and will be posted to the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department's YouTube channel. So thank you, everybody, again, for participating in the Environmental Engineering Graduate Seminar Series, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right.